This is Kelly.
This is Amy.
And you're listening to Diary of a Death Investigator. We are finally on episode 50, and we're going to do a mini-series called the Idaho Murder Series. And our first episode of that is going to be Who is Bryan Kohberger? So I have a unique fascination with this case. I think it's really interesting because it happened in a small town. Amy and I grew up in a small town, and it's not similar in looks.
No, it's like complete opposite, actually.
But similar in size. So the population of Moscow, Idaho is 26,000 people. The population of the town we grew up in now is like 22,000 people. So I think that it just kind of shook me because it's like, I would say because it happened in a small town, but we all know that there's a podcast called Small Town Murder. So we shouldn't be surprised.
That's actually like my favorite podcast. So it's hilarious, I have to say.
But for those people who aren't familiar with the Idaho murders, so on November 13th in 2022, 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho were murdered. And it happened in a really short amount of time. They think, Amy and I have read different things, but they're basically looking from 4 in the morning to 4:25 in the morning. Someone had entered the house, killed 4 of the college students, and then left. There's very little evidence the case. Now, there's a gag order on the trial. So no one who is involved in this family or anybody is allowed to talk about the case or give any details.
Yeah, because it technically hasn't gone to trial yet. And it's kind of a complicated trial, which we'll talk about this more, I think, in one of our later episodes, right? When it actually finally does go to trial, which poor families, they've been waiting for so long.
Yeah, it's been, so as of right now, the trial isn't going to happen until June of 25, which is, like you just said, the poor families are having to wait. And so because of all of that, there's a lot of information out there. Good, bad, ugly. You have some people who have written a book. There's actually a book that I listened to the Audible on. It's called When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders, written by Howard Bloom. I got a lot of information from his book, and that will be the base of a lot of what we tell you guys. I also listened to Nancy Grace. She has a podcast called Crime Stories with Nancy Grace. And so she had Howard Bloom on. She had a death investigator on that episode as well. So we're going to talk about the hows of this kind of case. That will be another episode. But this episode is just to kind of give you a background of Bryan Kohberger. And he is the person who allegedly killed these 4 students. So he is from Pennsylvania, and he had studied criminology in school. At the time of the murders, he was living in Pullman, Washington, and he was getting his PhD in criminology. So from Pullman to Moscow, Idaho, it's only like an 8 to 12 minute drive.
Yeah, because it's like 8.5 miles away, like across the border. So that's actually really important to remember, I think, throughout the entire case and investigation as well.
I even think the airport in Pullman is called Pullman Moscow Airport. Now, don't hold me to it, but I read that somewhere, which I think is pretty important because that's just how close I think these 2 cities were. And so Pullman, Washington is also really small, I think, tight-knit community. So it's just really interesting that the 2 are close together, and something like this would obviously shake the community up, right? So it was funny because when I was telling Mom about this case, and I was telling her oh, the case happened in Idaho, and she remembers it, but she said, where was it in Idaho? And I said, oh, it was in Moscow. And she goes, oh, it's such a cute little town, and the restaurants are really cute there. And I was like, oh, you stayed there? Well, of course, I said, where'd you stay? Did you drive past the house? She goes, Kelly, I wouldn't know where that house was. So I Googled it for her, and I showed her. And another fact that will come up later on is that this house that the students were murdered in, it wasn't like it was in a desolate part of town. It was right in the middle of things. With people all next door, there was an apartment complex next door. It's really interesting.
Well, the fraternities and sororities were right behind it. So,
yes, it's not like it was a desolate area. So that is actually comes into play, I think, later too.
Yeah. I also want to say, too, a lot of things about these smaller towns, and I will say anything about like college towns for a lot of people, too, that maybe don't live here or maybe live in like larger cities. The population of these smaller towns, they definitely rise and fall significantly and is noticeably different depending upon the time of year. Like if students in school are in session, especially where I live, it's, college town where I went to school, and you can definitely tell when school's in session and when it's not in session. So like Mom's saying, like, oh, it's such a cute town. Well, it probably started that way. And then when the university was built, it probably changed the town quite a bit. And probably the same thing with Pullman, because I'm pretty sure that's where Washington State University is as well. So probably both those towns are very dependent upon each university and the population of those universities. But it's probably not unusual to see the same cars driving fast, or like loud music playing, or hearing, students screaming at night, like just doing dumb things, or students not paying attention to things, what they would consider unusual during the middle of the night. So I will say, just that's something that I was thinking about before we started this was, small towns, their population during the school year might be 20-something thousand, but how much of that is like college students?
It's a lot. And they were saying that a majority of the people who are employed there are employed through the college. So I think you're right. Like, gotta love kids at 18 years, whether you're considered an adult or not, you're out in college. Like, this is where kids do a lot of dumb things, right? Because you think you're invincible. And that's the part, like, I think you think that way up until maybe you're like,
well, your brain is still developing at that age as well. I think that's why you see a lot of kids actually drinking and driving. Like you said, the invincibility thing.
My nephew is getting ready to go to college. We were talking about wearing flip-flops now. And, Jeff and I are in our 40s. Although if you ask my other nephew, I'm 28. But we can't wear flip-flops. Like Jeff said, I can't wear flip-flops that much anymore. And my nephew's like, I just walked 10 miles in mine, right? Like in his slides. And we're like, well, yeah, but over time, it's hard on your body. But now it's hard for him to comprehend, like, what do you mean it's hard on your body, right? So that's why they now have vans for old people, because we need the extra cushion. So things that you just don't think about. So yeah, you're right. Like, I actually thought about that as well as I watched some of these documentaries. First, it was like, well, why wouldn't someone have noticed? And I was like, well, because kids don't notice these kind of things. Like, they're like, oh, that's normal.
No, you don't think about walking by yourself at night when it's dark, and they're like, oh, this is a safe community. I can leave my doors unlocked. I can walk home drunk, like at night or whatever. Probably the only reason why you would even take like an Uber or something is probably because it's freezing there. I mean, honestly. So that's what I'm thinking. It's probably a really safe small community, because when you're listening even to things where they're talking to the coroner, they're like, yeah, things like this just don't happen here because it's a small community. Like the last time we've even had something like this happen, it like shook our town to the core, and it was like a murder suicide. And it's like, wow, that was the craziest thing that's happened to your town. That was like a normal scene for me that happened almost daily in my city where I work. Those kinds of things like this, that is like national, probably international news, would be a thing that would definitely not only startle the town and the college students, but be almost outlandish to even happen to a place like that.
Right. So you're not paying attention until you start asking people questions and until you start digging for information. And I heard this today. No, maybe it was yesterday. I was binging the first 48 where the guy was like saying there was a couple of murderers driving down the road. They knew where they were driving. And he's like, this is the time not to have road rage. Like, don't yell at the person next to you because you don't know who they are. And I think whether it's Bryan Kohberger or not, he was a really interesting character and he plays a really interesting part in this story, regardless if he was the murderer or not. So a little bit about him and his past. So he was going and getting his PhD in criminology. He was a TA, and I believe that he was on scholarship. As long as he was a TA, his tuition was covered, which I think the tuition was like $26,000 or something. It's not cheap to go to school. And I'm sure out-of-state tuition still applies and you're getting your PhD.
Yeah, I think it's an extra $5,000 a year when you're out of state, when you're not a resident of that state.
Yeah. So he wasn't very well liked by the students. He had a little bit what students felt like was a complex. They felt like he was a know-it-all. The women had filed some complaints against him because they felt like he was rude and just didn't like them. I think at one point he like failed almost the entire class or something. Yeah, he felt like they didn't do a good enough job. You know, it wasn't him, it was them. So I know that he had been talked to a few times about it.
I know if that was me, he'd begin to talk from me. So
yeah, it didn't land well with him. I think they did an investigation. So in the book that I listened to by Howard, he said that Bryan was actually fired. He had received a notice in the mail, but because he was gone for Thanksgiving break, he didn't get it. So the murders happened, like I said, they were on the 13th. And then he took off, I think, probably like, I don't know if it was the following week for Pennsylvania because he drove across country, but we'll talk about that in another episode. So what was also discussed in the book was that Bryan had a past heroin addiction. I believe that it was in high school. You have probably had more exposure to heroin than I did. Oh, but I should say, and this is totally off topic.
Not for my own usage.
Right.
Let's preface that. It's because of my job. Okay, thank you.
This is totally off topic, but I just want to plug it in here. Did Dad tell you that he was a hero the other day on his birthday? So real quick, guys, I have to put this in here. Hopefully he doesn't mind me sharing this story, but he comes home from work and I was at their house last week and he said that it was 113, I think, degrees that day outside. It's been so hot. Just for reference, I don't do well in the heat anymore. My house is 60 degrees right now. I don't have an air conditioner. He saw this gentleman with his crack pipe on the side of the road, no shirt on. And basically the guy, like, he asked if he was okay. The guy was like saying he's hot. He thinks he was having a heat stroke. My dad's like, yeah, you're probably having a heat stroke.
You're tweaking, which will raise your body temperature for one.
Yes. So probably got hot, took his shirt off. Then he gave him a couple bottled water. The guy chugged the water. This is what I found really interesting. Dad asked him if there was a number he could call. The guy had this number memorized. I don't have anybody's phone number memorized except for like Mom, Dad's, and Jeff's. Like, I don't have any phone number memorized. So the fact that this guy tweaking out still knew.
Well, if he didn't have a phone, I mean, it's more important for him to be able to buy his crack than it was to pay for a cell phone bill, Kelly.
So he did end up calling somebody and they asked Dad to like move him into the shade. And so he did. And I guess the guy like picked up his garbage, which, you know, was important to Dad. Dad didn't have to ask him. I think he just prompted it like, oh, don't want to leave garbage behind kind of thing. So at least he was a responsible addict-ish, right? I guess he shouldn't have been walking in 113 degree weather. So anyway, that made me think of it because of the heroin piece, but also the mental state of people who have addictions.
It's priorities, Kelly. Addicts have priorities, and the heat was not a priority. His priority was getting high, and the consequences were to dehydrate and possibly be hyperthermic. So there you go.
Well, speaking of addiction and people who are addicts, so do you think that Bryan Kohberger's past heroin addiction could affect his decision making?
Okay, so it definitely depends on one, how much he used or for like how long he used for, because the amount of damage that could possibly do to his brain or body, that would determine the amount of damage that could do to him. Now, we know that drugs will have a physical effect, but also a mental effect as well. And I've said this before, when you see people that are doing drugs, you automatically think like, oh, they're crazy, because it does affect their mentality. So as I've said, it affects your brain. So it affects basically the physiological processes of your brain, which is irreversible. And so it's taking away or eating away at the white matter of your brain, which is like the inner part of your brain. And so this part of your brain is going to be responsible for your decision making, the part of your brain that's also like regulating your behavior and your responses to stress. So typically, this is also what you see, the part of the brain that is diminishing for people who are Alzheimer's and dementia patients. And so that's why we see these patients also become like irritable, and they might become like angry. And so it could also be the same kind of concept with people who have had addictions and long-term drug usage, when they can also become or seem to be like irrational and almost seem to like snap and become upset and poor decision making and have poor responses to high stress situations. So clearly, it didn't diminish his brain, enough to the point to where he can still make good decisions as far as having good memory skills, as far as being able to go to school and work on his PhD, those kinds of things. But it could affect that portion of the brain. It protects like your nerves. So it could have still damaged part of his brain to the effect that it could have caused some damage there. I told you earlier that if his defense is not able to come up with a good defense for him, they could maybe possibly come up with something that is like he's not in his right state of mind, or was not in the right state of mind, or does not have the mental capacity to defend himself in the way that he did not make the right decisions during the act of the crime, or he snapped during the crimes. And they could even do like brain scans, possibly to show that he doesn't have this portion of his brain working or functioning properly, in order to say that he's not coherent enough to testify in court.
Do you think he's mentioned that he had visual snow in the way that it's been described? Because I saw like on a documentary, like where it was like a clear image and then visual snow would be like, it's like pixelated type thing, where it's almost like the visual snow you would see on TV, right? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. He said that it caused him to lack empathy and he didn't feel like consequences. Like he didn't care what he said because he didn't feel the consequences of that. Could that be a side effect of drugs, or is that just something else?
I feel like that's a weird thing to blame on his lack of empathy. When I think of the visual snow, I think of that just being like a filter, I guess, in your ocular vision. Now, I guess if he were to say, I have like a mental disorder, and that I feel like I have like a mental static where I can't think clearly, that would be more relatable than saying, when I think of like visual snow, I think of like, okay, you put on like a pair of glasses or like a filter over your eyes where you're not seeing things clearly. I mean, I guess like metaphorically, like I can't see things clearly, so therefore I can't think through things clearly. And so I'm not empathetic. Like I don't see the relation that he's making there. Now, using drugs, like I said, like if you're using enough to where it could impact your brain function, yeah, you're not going to be able to think clearly. So I don't know how visual snow is a way for him to say, I'm not empathetic anymore.
Or at all, ever. Maybe he just never was. And that's what he's saying, like, is why. So another side effect, which I don't know if this is actually a side effect or if he just decided to change himself. He lost 100 pounds, which every day I said, I'm going to lose 100 pounds. No, not really. But like, that's dedication and determination, right? So like, you have to be really dedicated to lose 100 pounds. Everybody listening to this knows how hard it is to lose like 5 pounds, 10 pounds. Like,
did they say in like a time frame of how he lost that weight?
If they did, I wasn't paying attention. It could have been like, let's say even over a year, but you and I both know even over a year, like he's now a very small human being. I say small. He has an athletic build. Yeah. And he's like 5'11", right? Like 5'11"-ish. So to lose 100 pounds is just a significant amount of weight. I also have this theory. So I've thought, well, maybe it was heroin, but I'm not so sure. I kind of have this theory that addicts never quit being addicts. So whether they're addicted to drugs or they're addicted to alcohol, they will find something new to be addicted to. And, you know, I've seen it where addicts are addicted to now work, right? So they switch from being alcoholics to now being addicted to work, where work consumes them, which is good because they do get a lot accomplished. They can just drive other people crazy. But the same thing with weight loss. He went from being a heroin addict, which he didn't care about his body per se, right? So now he's really into caring about himself. So he lost 100 pounds. He had a couple of cosmetic surgeries. I'll also say this. I thought it was really interesting because this is all before, I mean, maybe he was going through it during college, but when the murders happened, he was 27 years old because his birthday would have been like the following week. That's pretty young to lose that much weight and still have cosmetic surgery and everything, right? Also, where is the income coming from for you to have this kind of surgery? Maybe it's covered by insurance, but to me, that's considered cosmetic.
Maybe his parents had money to do.
His parents don't have money. Well, or they didn't. So I think his dad was maybe a janitor. They both worked at the school. So, you know, schools don't pay a ton of money. The house that I saw that his parents were living in now is a pretty nice house, but he's getting his PhD. It's not like he has a ton of money either.
Right. And then he just lost his job.
He doesn't know that he lost his job, right? Because he left before he got the notice, is my understanding. So
do we know if he was working while he was getting his master's or anything like that?
I don't think so. Here's the other thing. It wasn't like, I think he moved there, and let's say the school year started in August. This all happened in November. So he wasn't there for very long.
Well, there's stuff that I will bring up later, but I think he was there longer than what we thought.
Oh. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is it possible with this new weight loss, new Bryan Kohberger, that he could be suffering from imposter syndrome?
Everything that is basically like him to a T, because it's like he's trying to like reinvent himself. You know, he moves all the way across the country and it's like he's basically trying to become a new person. I mean, you know, who wouldn't? Because it sounds like when he was in high school, he was a bigger person and I think he was bullied, and then he loses all this weight, and then they said his behavior changed, and then he basically became the bully. So then he moves, and it's like, well, didn't you say that his friends even said he had changed?
Yeah, I think his friends kind of felt like he became this elitist, like his friends from high school that they went back and interviewed, because they said like, oh yeah, you know, he went from doing drugs or being just like us to now thinking that he's better than us. So it is like he was chasing something and wanted to be something else. And I don't know if that's because he was so worried about his mental state or if he just wanted to be better, like a better I don't want to say a better human being because I don't know that he actually was a better human, like an emotional better human being, or he just wanted to think that he was better than everybody else, like an arrogance, right? Like he just wanted to, no one knew who he was when he came to Washington. Like he didn't know anybody. He didn't have any friends. And one of the things that was told in the book was a story of him going to a pool party by his neighbor in Pullman. And it was I'm going to say and assume that it was a college party, which I kind of thought was weird because at 27 going to college parties, like now you're talking about 18-year-old, like, I don't know. So it could have been like an older, like maybe a graduate party, because I don't know how many students are. To me, that's weird, right? Like, I think it's weird anyway.
But hey, if you're trying to meet people, I don't know.
So anyway, the story goes that he was sitting there and he got up and like asked a girl for her phone number. And then she gave it to him. And then he asked her friend for her phone number, the girl that she was talking to. And then she gave it to him. And to the knowledge of the author, he didn't call either one of them. I don't know if that's just like, let's see.
Yeah, test the waters.
Yeah, like I thought it was pretty bold. Like, oh, you're going to ask one friend and then turn around and ask the other friend.
Maybe he didn't know they were friends at the time. Who knows?
Yeah. And in my mind, it's like they were talking to each other. So like he did know. But the arrogance to ask both of them, right? Like I also kind of thought, well, he's not scared of rejection. He didn't have fear. I also had heard that, the fact that he didn't like women, but it came up again from his graduate days or his days. I think it was where he was at, is it DeSalle? Where is that at?
It's in Pennsylvania. So it's literally like 37 miles south, I think, of where his parents live or something like close like that.
And so he was a frequent patron of this bar, and he was not very nice to the women. But what they found was, and the women kind of thought was creepy, which I could see this as being creepy. I can also see this as being socially awkward. He would ask the girls where they lived and if they were there with somebody. So kind of bold. I guess it's just better than hitting on them and then their boyfriends being there or something. I do know he got pretty belligerent one night and called, I think, the bartender a name or something. And so the next time he went in there, they told him, oh, we're happy to have you, but you can't act like this anymore. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And they're like, well, you acted like this. And he was so upset with them, totally denied it, and then just never came back. So you don't think someone like that's guilty?
Well, I'll tell you, this is because I'm not a therapist or psychiatrist, but this is from Dr. Valerie Young. So she says there are 5 imposter types. So there's 5 different types of imposters. And I think he could definitely fit a couple of these. So the first one here, this is the perfectionist. And so this type believes that unless you were absolutely perfect, you could have done better. You feel like an imposter because your perfectionist traits make you believe that you're not as good as others might think you are. Then the second one is the expert, who feels like an imposter because they don't know everything there is to know about a particular subject or topic, or they haven't mastered every step in a process because there is more for them to learn. They don't feel as if they've reached the rank of expert. The natural genius is the third one, and this imposter syndrome, you may feel like a fraud simply because you don't believe that you are naturally intelligent or competent. If you don't get something right the first time around, it takes you longer to master a skill. The soloist, it's also possible to feel like an imposter if you had to ask for help to reach a certain level or status. Since you couldn't get there on your own, you question your competence or abilities. And the super person, this type of imposter syndrome involves believing that you must be the hardest worker or reach the highest level of achievement possible. And if you don't, you are a fraud. So it sounds like he was wanting to be this certain person and was working towards this PhD and maybe was trying too hard and was putting off this different type of persona than what he had always been.
I actually think that's really interesting because I just thought of this. what if all this is just a facade and because he really is like driven to kill people? Again, he allegedly killed these people, but what if all of this has been created as like his new person to hide who he really is, which is somebody who would have this fascination of killing people, because we know that he had a Reddit post. And what did the Reddit post say?
Oh, okay. So this Reddit post, he actually was, like conducting a survey, which the first time when I originally saw that, I thought that this was basically for like some type of dissertation research. And so then I was like, oh, well, that's kind of weird. He was asking in this survey, did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? And then it says, please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this point. So basically, he wants to know like their emotions and like how they felt during the crime. And then basically as well, it kind of seems like he is wanting to improve upon a crime. I mean, essentially because those people got caught.
He wasn't writing this for a paper?
It says that it came back up after his crime or right before he was coming into working for or attempting to work as an intern for the local police department. So it wasn't actually ever stated that it was for like a dissertation or confirmed.
Yeah, so he could have been doing all this research because he was trying to create the perfect crime because he is a perfectionist. And this is like the rest of the stuff is facade. And he's just trying to get to, I mean, what do you do with the PhD in criminology?
You study criminals. I mean, it's like criminal theory and it's a broad umbrella. Criminology can cover, anything from policing, profiling, forensics, and then you can branch out from that. But it sounds like he probably wanted to teach if he's getting his PhD, if he was like a TA. I mean, that's really what academias do with the PhD, especially if they're doing like studies like that, because I've had professors that have done like similar type of things. They've literally gone to jails and have interviewed murderers and have asked them similar questions, and they have written books about them. And it is like helpful research for profiling because like the FBI had used that for like such a long time. And criminology is just a very broad umbrella that a lot of things fall under. But honestly, it sounds like the path that he was going under was,
I'm saying allegedly, was self-indulgence?
kind of. I mean, as weird as this, there are a lot of weirdos out there, and I've met a lot of them in school. And some people just have a really weird fascination with other weirdos. And it's like, they want to know why people do these things, but they kind of like get an enjoyment out of it. And it's like, well, why?
Well, don't you think that could be said about the people who listen to our podcast? I mean, we listen because it's interesting.
It's not their whole life. When you make it into your whole entire life, that's when it becomes like concerning to me. When you're like, I eat, sleep, breathe crime, and my whole life is documentaries, and I eat my coffee and chocolate ice cream for breakfast with my true murderer, whatever. And it's like,
well, hopefully you're not eating your coffee.
But you know what I mean? Like, this was like his whole life is what it sounds like. And for him to basically fail a whole class of students because it didn't make his standards of what a paper was supposed to be for this, I don't know.
So speaking of profiling classes, you mentioned in one of our episodes that there was a theory of somebody who had physical characteristics of a murderer. Do you feel like Bryan Kohberger would fit that theory?
So I actually did this in a criminology class because I did criminal justice with forensic science. And this was in a criminal theory class. Now, this is like an old theory. And so this is based on the Lombroso theory. And Lombroso basically said that if you had these physical characteristics, that you were more apt to basically commit crimes more so than like other individuals. And a lot of these individuals kind of had more of these caveman type features. And they got this idea based on people that were incarcerated. So they would take measurements of like people's faces, for example. So like the distance between like people's eyes and like the width of like their entire head or like their dimensions. So some things that are like prominent features, right? Like, so prominent eyebrow, like larger noses, like Neanderthal type of features. So like club type hands, things that would be like helpful more for like a hunter. So one of the big things that actually helped them kind of identify Bryan was, they said, his bushy eyebrows, because that was something one of the survivors said, was that they were able to see his large brow. He had bushy eyebrows, and they said that he had an athletic build. So I would think, when I think of this like theory, one of the main things is like a prominent brow.
Yeah. And I think that his brows stand out even more because I've like told you this before, like you have fat in your forehead, right? So if you go around looking at certain people, you can see where it's almost like the Frankenstein brow, right? Where you have like a ledge that your eyebrow looks like it sits on or is below. And for a lot of people, as we get older, we just lose fat in that area. And that's why the brow gets more prominent. But for Bryan, I mean, he did lose a lot of weight. So I don't know if maybe that has become more distinctive. But I would also say that as he's gotten older, and I know all of us get this way, like our faces fill out a little bit more, but I feel like he's almost gotten more of like a square structure to his face. Like he became like more like caveman looking.
Yeah, we'll have to post this like on our page. There's actually, it's Italian, so it says type stick criminels, and it gives you 6 different figures. And one of the side profiles, it is this man that has kind of this long hooked nose with these more narrow set, like beady eyes and a pronounced brow, kind of like him. And so you're kind of like, oh, like that's interesting. So yeah, this study was done in like the 1870s, but you're like, okay, if you're able to, I don't know, kind of look at all these similar distinct features, it's like, oh, well, and each one of these, there's different types of features for the type of crime. So I'll read to you what each one of these has. So the first one here is features of the thief. So it's an expressive face, manual dexterity, and small wandering eyes. Features of women offenders are shorter and more wrinkled, darker hair, and smaller skulls than, quote, normal women. Features of sex offenders have thick lips and protruding ears. And the features of the murderer are cold, glassy stares, bloodshot eyes, and big hawk-like noses. So I'll have to show you or send to you this picture. Now, given the time that this was, you also have to take into effect like your ethnicities that are there during that time and possibly what's going on in that time in the world and like what different ethnicities could be there. So with a grain of salt, right? But I think that there are some things to note, but I think that there's a reason why you still study these things. It's a theory for a reason, right?
Well, that's good. Speaking of another theory, this will be the last thing I bring up about Bryan during this episode. And then the next episode, we'll get into like how something like this happens. But I think it might have popped up on like one of the documentaries. I don't know if it's the documentary that you and I watched about the murders or if it was the cyber sleuthing one where the cyber sleuths have figured out some information. Here's what I'll say. I know I laugh about cyber sleuthing, but I am a cyber sleuth.
I know. It's like takes one to know one.
But here's what I'll say. When I first heard about this, I went straight to their Instagram pages, the victims' pages. And you can find out a lot about somebody on their social media. And this is why anybody listening, and mostly any of your kids who've graduated or haven't graduated or will be going off to college, it's really important, or any kid or adult, you can find out a lot of information. And these people who spend all day sleuthing will magnify, will like take things frame by frame, and they will find out where you are and what's happening. So beware. But there's also good information that comes from this. You know, there's people who are caught because of cyber sleuths. Now, I'm not saying like, there's also those people who make money off of sleuthing. I do it more of like fact checking, which we'll have. Cyber sleuthing is how we get the Where Are We Now episodes, or Where Are They Now? But one of the things that came up was that it's possible that Bryan was an incel. And I had to look this up. And so according to the dictionary, an incel is a member of an online community of young men who consider themselves unable to attract women sexually, typically associated with views that are hostile toward women and men who are sexually active. So self-identified incels have used the internet to find anonymous support. I don't think that that's important necessarily now, but it could be in later episodes that when we start discussing like the whys or how some of this happens, right? Or like even evidence, like digital evidence. So yeah, I had never heard of it before.
I had no idea that was a thing. I was like, is that like an actual group? Like you have to join a group? Is it a club? Do you pay dues?
Hey, there's clubs for everything.
Well, do they have like evidence of him like interacting online with that kind of thing?
Somebody brought this up because they thought possibly. Now, because there's a gag order right now, a lot of the evidence is on lockdown, right? So the information that people are getting are from friends and family. One of the victims' dads, who I can't blame him, and we'll talk about this later, he's like not waiting for the police and law enforcement to figure it out. And let's be honest, like our dad would be the exact same way. He wouldn't wait. He wouldn't sit on it. Vigilantes, right? Like this is how I understand there's a certain process on things. And I think the reason that this case has become so interesting to a lot of people is just because, one, Bryan Kohberger seems very disengaged when you watch him on TV. Like I did see, and I'll talk about this later, a reaction that he had that I like had seen, but it's just slow moving and there's a lot of pieces. And I think for Moscow, it's beneficial for them to move on as a community.
For the family to start healing, you want that for them. And it's been so long, they deserve for it to start.
Yeah. And the trial's not happening into now, it's July of 25. So again, when all this happened, I remember when things were coming out, I was at Disneyland. I was in line. I was screenshotting who these people were. And I'm like, wait, how did this happen? How could this have happened so quickly? How does somebody go into a house and they don't have like the person that did it already, right? Like, how do they not have any information? And you find out later on the why. Anyway, you'll understand later why. Like I said, case has been super interesting to me. It's a little obsessive, but not in the creepy, not in the creepy true crime way, in the way that it's just like.
Not in Amy's definition of creepy.
Yeah. Maybe you guys come up with another creepy way, but I'm just saying like, I just found, mostly because I keep bringing it up to you, like, I just can't believe that something like this could happen.
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely agree because there's no way that it wasn't planned by the minute-to-minute detail.
Yep. So we'll give you guys details later, but if you have any questions, you can email us at kelly@diaryofadeathinvestigator.com, or you can message us on Instagram @diaryofadeathinvestigator. We appreciate you guys listening. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for our new listeners. We see you. We appreciate you.
We see you. Kelly sees you, I'm sure.
I don't know who you are. I just know where you are. We appreciate, like I said, the likes and the comments, good, bad. We want to be better. So if there's anything that you guys, emails, Charisma, where are you? We want to know if you got the job.
Yeah, seriously. I've actually been really wanting to know. Please let us know.
We check our email every day. So, but until next time, thank you.
Bye.